3, 2, and 1. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Life Edge, because life just doesn't have to be mediocre. I'm joined today by Dr. Susan Nash. Now, she's not mediocre. Hey, Susan, how are you today?
Great. It's a hot one today.
Is it really?
95 degrees with what feels like 95% humidity.
Oh, you don't want to know what we're like. 74, kind of dry, pretty. It's the coast. We're getting a nice breeze. Supposed to be hot this weekend.
Well, that's nice.
Here's our intro, and then we'll introduce our guest. Here we go. We're back. Susan, would you like to introduce our guest?
I'm delighted. Our guest is Bill Fairhurst, and he is going to talk to us about a topic that will help us all, which is developing creativity and as it ties to entrepreneurship. Welcome, Bill.
Good afternoon, Susan, and good afternoon, Rick. Pleased to be here.
Hi, Bill.
Well, Bill, how did you get interested in and become a true believer in creativity in entrepreneurship?
Well, Susan, a lot of what we're going to talk about today as far as creativity stems out of the creativity portion, and really stems out of talks that I've been asked to give primarily in the oil and gas industry. And I've been lucky enough to be involved in several of the large discoveries in the United States that bring energy to our entire society. And as a result of those large discoveries, then technical communities ask me to come in typically and say, Bill, how were you involved in that, or how was that discovery made, and what was the creative process behind making that new natural resource discovery? And those talks are fun. I really enjoy giving those. I think people get a lot out of seeing those presentations. But what I finally realized after doing that many times was, I think what's more important than each specific creative idea that led to a new discovery in the United States was the strategic thinking process and the creative process that got us to that new discovery. And so through that and through a number of presentations that I did, some with Susan at the American Association of Petroleum Geologists and the Society of Petroleum Engineers, I developed this more general process of going back and just looking at the overall, the 50,000 foot. How do we develop and manage that creative and that strategic process?
Now, Bill, you brought with you a presentation that we have online. Do you want to go through that?
Sure. Let's do that, and I'll kind of lead you through slides as we go. And this is kind of a shorter version of some things that Susan's already seen. But if we bring up the first slide, that just kind of gives you an idea, a little bit more of what we want to talk about is helping, and for people on the education side that are listening today, what we want to do is develop in young people the ability to think critically and think creatively and develop strategic thinking in young people. Because as you'll see in the process of going through these slides, that it's a process that really needs to begin as early as possible with somebody, and that we really want these skills, the basis for these skills, developed by the time that they're 30 years old. Mm-hmm. They can be developed and you can work on them after that time, but you're not going to develop them as successfully as you can when you start these processes earlier. And when we talk about this on the second slide, what we're really going to get to is in critical thinking. And for our audience, I just want to point out again, when I say critical, I'm not thinking of the typical conversation critical, which means I'm picking on somebody. What I'm really talking about in critical is having the evaluation process down and being able to understand the evaluation process and have good critical discriminating thinking developed. This first chart that we're looking at really is what we're looking at on the x-axis here, is that we're looking at the complexity of sciences, and I'll explain that in a minute. And when I'm talking about sciences, I'm talking about both the natural and physical sciences as well as the behavioral. So this has to do with every technical discipline. But on the left, you'll see that the left-hand side, that we have relatively simple or non-complex. Now, this does not mean that the sciences themselves are not complex, but what we mean by complexity in this sense, and we'll define that, and we're defining complexity as the number of laws for a particular scientific endeavor. On the far left-hand side, you can see that there are a lot of laws in our very, very basic natural sciences. Math and chemistry and physics are defined by a lot of laws. And as we move to the right-hand side, we get into some historical sciences, which become more complex because there are fewer defined laws and there are greater complexities in the sense of there are more variables that are impact the particular science. As we get far over to the far right-hand side, we're talking about, in this sense, very complex sciences. There are very few laws that govern those sciences, and there are a lot of other variables outside disciplines that have to be considered in those areas.
Now, Bill,
we go on to the next slide.
Now, Bill, just a quick question. I remember when I was studying engineering, and it was chemical engineering back when, we would talk about what were the sciences, which are usually what they called math-based ones, and a lot of the scientists back then would always call everything else art. More artistic, actually, though some of them were scientifically based. But would you say that to a certain point is true, that it's easier to figure out the scientific ones that are math-based because you know what the laws are, and then you start getting out into the other fringes and they're not so math-based, or at least non-Newtonian based, if you will. Would you say that's kind of an accurate statement?
It's very accurate, and we'll see that on the next slide here too, Rick. Okay. And this is just a revision of that first slide that I've worked on. And the upper half of that, I've put kind of what we talk about of the natural sciences that we talk about. And Rick, in that column, you can see on the far right-hand side, physics and chemistry, and math on the upper portion of the far left curve. And then as we and then you'll see as you start moving to the right, and this is not to scale. And we can debate about where everything should be placed, but generally everybody's going to put these about the same place. And you can see that right away we get into the engineering field, Rick, where you worked, and it's very heavily based on the math and sciences. As we go then a little bit further to the right on the science scale, we get into geologic and biological, and there time and other sciences start to come into play. And as we get into the far right-hand side on the lower portion of it, right underneath political sciences, there is art and literature that you were just discussing. And so engineers, for example, think geologists are artists. Well, in a sense, they're true. Geologists have to be very well based in the sciences on the far left, the math and the chemistry and the science, and we're going to see this developed a little bit more in the next slides. And on the far right, the complexities that getting things over into the far right are the arts. Now, another interesting aspect of this that we don't have time to go into today in detail, but I want to fly over this very quickly, is that it's very possible that somebody that is very intelligent and understands the laws of science at a very young age can make a very critical breakthrough. And there we'll give the example of Einstein. When he was a very young man, less than 30 years old, he was making very critical, significant breakthroughs in sciences. As we go over to the far right, and we go all the way over to arts, and let's pick Hemingway. Hemingway wrote some excellent short stories when he was in his late teens and early 20s, and wrote some great books. But his really acclaimed book, Old Man and the Sea, he wrote at an older age, and the reasons being that we see this, and I can go through the entire list of Nobel laureates as an example of doing this when we have more time, that you'll see the Nobel laureates in the pure sciences are younger people. And that when we get over into the arts and literature like Hemingway, that his classical work is done at a much later age and stage in life, because it takes not only these pure science skills, but it takes integration of all these other disciplines when we get into these less complex or more complex sciences. So let's move on to the next area.
Bill, let me ask you a question as we move to the next area, as we go to the next slide. My question is, looking at that, A, why does it matter? And then B, it looks to me that you're suggesting that the key to creativity in this is being able to blend art and science and not just stick to one dogmatic way of thinking.
Yeah, and we'll tie this all together here at the end, Susan, but you're absolutely right. If you're in one of the pure sciences, chemistry, math, physics, you can become an expert in that one area of science. Now, if you're a physicist, you obviously have an extremely strong math background. You understand chemistry very well. You can only integrate those. As we get over to the arts, it's not only having the experience and the knowledge, for example, with Hemingway, not only having the skill and the years of practice of being a great writer, it took him years and years to develop the additional outside skills. And let's compare geology and engineering. Engineering is a little bit closer towards the pure math. Geology involves long time periods, and those long time periods, and you also have to integrate other interdisciplines into the geologic sciences, not just pure engineering, not just pure math. You have to add biology into it and time frames, and that makes it less complicated in the series of there aren't as many direct laws. And it takes longer for the mind and the human experience to synthesize these to make a major breakthrough in one of those areas. But let's go to the next series, and we'll see this developing when we look at Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm glad to share this because I know a lot of people in education also work with Bloom's taxonomy that was developed in the 50s and has been revised. But I want to start down at the bottom part of that, and it relates back to the questions that have already been asked, that the very basic part of being able to be a good scientist, a physical and natural scientist or a social scientist, is that you have to remember what you have been taught and what you've learned through your experiences and what you've read is the most basic portion of that. And then understanding that, being able to understand and interrelate items. And I put a line above understanding because there's a major leap, I think, to the next level. But you can remember and understand and be a very intelligent person and do very well academically with just these two lower levels of understanding. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to make a jump, really, and we're just walking up Bloom's taxonomy here. But now we're really going to take a jump and go to applying, analyzing, and evaluating. And you can see that you can't be a good evaluator, and you can't get up to that block unless you are very good at remembering and understanding, which were the lower two blocks. And so what I recommend for young people especially is, when you're learning to become a scientist of any type, social or natural physical sciences, that what you want to do is you want to become as expert in everything that's being fed to you at that time, because unless you're very good at those steps and get through those steps, you won't know how to apply your science, you won't be able to analyze, and we finally get up to evaluation. And when we finally get to evaluation is where we get to the first of the three major steps that we're talking about, and that's being a good critical reader, a good critical evaluator. And again, it's not criticism per se, as much as it is being able to evaluate and discern the important points within the science.
Well, I think at the top, yes. Oh, good, we're getting to the top. I like this part, the create part and apply.
Okay, and we finally get to the very top in the next slide, and you'll see there I've even separated that even further, because we finally have gotten past critical and evaluating and being a good evaluator, and you finally get to being creative. And so when young people ask me, how did we make this natural resource discovery, or what were the items that led to it, I can tell them how I did it. But if the best way for them to teach them how to do it is make sure that they're very strong in each of these steps through Bloom's taxonomy, to get up to the point of being a good evaluator. And once you've gotten to that point, then if you're very strong in all these steps as we go on, again, there's a large separation, but we get into the very few people that can make the creative thinking and are able to do that. And so again, this is not just a systematic step at this point, this is a large leap. And so there will be a lot of people that are very good social scientists, which includes economy and all the behavioral sciences, but also be very good at the basic sciences. And they'll be very intelligent people, but they never make these steps because they haven't gone through the process of becoming a good evaluator to get to that point where they can possibly be a good creative thinker.
Now, Bill, it's interesting because the evaluation step kind of ties in with what neuroscience and neuropsychology talk about, which is that our brains are pattern recognition machines. Therefore, the more patterns we recognize and can quickly put together, the quickly we can evaluate and get to somewhere. And that's what's fascinating, because it really comes down to evaluation becomes pattern recognition almost.
So cool.
And that is very true. The scientific process is this is a very human endeavor of science, and to separate it from the arguments that we have between theology and science. Science is not theology, and theology is not science. Science is a process that we can understand in the human mind, mostly through mathematics, and we learn the scientific process very early in high school, and we practice that process through the undergraduate into the graduate programs. And so that, Rick, you're absolutely right. So you've gone through this process and this pattern recognition, but you're thinking along these ways. One reason I really wanted to talk about critical thinking is because what's really important for the scientists there is understanding the difference of when we're doing critical thinking in the scientific sense, because what I've seen over the last couple decades, applying this within a practical business sense, is that oftentimes our science is driven by management, and sometimes our science at a very large scale is driven by a political process. And that's okay, but what I preach to scientists is that we need to understand what we add as scientists to the argument. If politicians or managers want to have a different discussion on economics or on policy, that's fine. The scientists should not get involved in the policy decisions and the policy conversations. They should simply be supplying the scientific interpretation and experience that they have to those that are the policymakers and the managerial decision makers in a creative process. For example, the discovery of hydrocarbons is not only a scientific endeavor, it's also an economic endeavor. And so we have to use our scientific skills, but we also have to be working with managers that understand the business skills associated with that. Let me tie that in with one more idea, and then Susan and Rick, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on your side of it. The last segment that I want to go into is time, and this is why I think it's very important to understand this at a very early age, and for the educators out there to understand this so they can start applying it in the education system. Because I'd like people in high school and college and graduate programs to understand this before they ever get out into the real world, whether that's going on in academics and teaching and doing research science, or whether that's going into an industry and doing applied sciences. And here what we're looking at is, I put age down on the x-axis here, starting at about 20 in that column and going all the way over to 70 on the far right-hand side. And on the y-axis I've put time frames. And for people that can see that is that I've got a 1 year time frame, and I put that in light green. Most people, their entire careers and their entire lives, they will spend in this 1 year time frame. And we call that the operational planning time frames. And what I mean by this is most people will spend their life in this time frame. Is that if I'm working on a factory floor, and I just saw a great guy in an interview on television that makes 483 doors for a Ford truck a day. which means that he's making a door a minute, basically, kind of rate. If he's making a door a minute, that means the materials arrive in his workstation, and he snaps on the parts that he needs to in a certain sequence, and within a minute, he's completed that sequence and he's passed it on to the next portion of the assembly line. If you're doing that kind of work, your time frame planning is 1 minute. If you're doing drywall, the supervisor might come in and say to two guys working on a team, I want you to drywall these 2 rooms today. Well, that's a 1-day kind of time frame, although the supervisor is probably working on a week kind of time frame thinking pattern. So that's why most people spend most of their lives in that 1 year time frame, and that's just fine and wonderful, but that does not lead to longer term strategic thinking, and this is what we want to get to with strategic thinking. In the yellow box, we're talking about near future strategic planning, and I'm going out a 2 to 3 year time frame there. And when we're looking at natural resource development, those are kind of the time frames that people that are doing exploration work in natural resources will be looking in is 2 or 3 year planning process. And that process might be in year 1, I might go out and acquire a tract of land. Year 2, I'm doing some scientific evaluation. And year 3, I've assimilated all the scientific work that I did in year 2. I've come to some type of conclusion. I've presented that conclusion to management, which gives the business team time to go out and execute in year 3. Well, if I understand that entire time frame and I'm managing that time frame, then I'm typically looking at a 2 to 3 year type strategic planning time frame. Now, somebody that is a senior in high school that says, well, I'm planning out for 5 years because I'm going to go to college for 4 years and I'm going to get an entry-level job. That's not 4 year time thinking. That's a well-organized, well-known process. What I'm talking about is actually doing a creative process, a unique planning process. If we go above that, then we start to look at 4 to 5 year time frames, and there's really not that many people that will be thinking in these longer term kind of time frames, but it's very important that we develop people early in their careers that have the ability to think past that. And where you might think past that is, if I take the example of thinking in 3 year time frames, if I have multiple teams working for me that are multiple stages within this process, I might have one team that's in the first year of that process. I might have several other teams that are in the 3rd year of the process. But to put those together, I have to be thinking in 5 year kind of processes, and that's where it comes up into. Hopefully these top levels that we look at, the blue and the gray, who's thinking in those kind of time frames? Well, hopefully the people that are, and where I've seen the best examples really of long-term strategic thinking are the CEOs of the largest organizations that you can think of in the United States. General Electric, ExxonMobil, Chevron. Those senior managers are thinking in time frames of what their corporation is going to be doing 10 to 15 years from now. We'd also hope that our political leaders are thinking in those kind of time frames, that our president and the senators are thinking in longer time frames. And that's why one reason I think it's great that senators have a 6 year window to do their work, because they should be thinking 10, 15 year time frames out. And then we have people that are elected 2 years to Congress, and they're thinking shorter time frames out. But it's important to have people at these strategic plans and these strategic periods of time. So let's go to the next diagram, and let me give you some examples of this. And why I want these thoughts brought to young people is that I'm going to start with, there's a line out there, and there's a single line that goes from age 20 that stays in that 1 year time frame all the way through somebody at 75 years old. And as I said, most people will spend most of their lives and most of their careers in those 1 year time frames, and there's nothing wrong with that. We just understand the strategic time periods that they're thinking of. So let's go to the next guy up, who comes to an organization who's been very well trained and is at the top of Bloom's taxonomy of the thought process. And as someone who's in their mid-20s, let's say, and is thinking 1 to 2 year time frames, as you can see, and then I've got a solid line for that individual up to the age of 30 that's now thinking in these 3-year time frames at the age of 30, and in their mid-20s they were thinking in 1-year time frames. Then I have dashed lines because the potential for that individual is that individual may go and spend time in that lower dashed line. He may spend some additional time in these 3-year time frames and eventually get into where he's thinking in 4 or 5-year time frames for the organization. That upper dashed line is we've taken that individual a bit faster, and he goes through that 5-year time frame, and he does that with flying colors and shows that he can think in 5-year time frames and he can manage people and processes in 5-year time frames. That person has the potential to become the CEO of their organization when they're 30 years old. Somebody who's not thinking in 3-year time frames by the time they're 30 probably does not have the potential to become the chief, the CEO of an organization during that period of time. And then I've got the exceptional individual on the far left there, and someone that very quickly, by their mid-20s, shows us that they're thinking in 3-year time frames and goes up farther and faster. And so you can see the earlier we introduce time frame thinking, which is the entire process of setting out, having a dream, putting that dream down on paper, putting the steps and the time that's going to get to each process, which is the strategic planning portion of that. The sooner that somebody can develop those skills and show those skills, and there are a lot of organizations that use this kind of thinking to try and identify people by the age of their 30 who can possibly become the CEO of this organization. And we all know a lot of very intelligent people that are not going to become senior managers of the company, but they're going to contribute a lot to the company. They're just not these strategic long-term thinkers that we're looking at and that we need within our organizations. So let me tie this all together, because we've talked about 3 different areas. I think these time frames relate to critical thinking. I think they relate to being able to be a creative thinker and making that very dramatic breakthrough either for your science or for the company that you're working for. And then finally in strategic thinking long-term, they're all interrelated processes as we look at each one of these individual steps that we've talked about. And we could obviously spend years talking about each one of these individual categories, but being able to fly through this pretty quickly, I think that's a good outline for us to start with.
That was actually excellent. And, one of the things that I was watching now Bloom's taxonomy was done in the 50s, correct?
Bloom's taxonomy and the thought process was originally done in the 1950s. 50s. And some of these revisions have occurred, slowly over time since then, yes.
Because if you notice, one thing that's going on in today's society is that everything is rushed. Those lines are blurred, especially as you get to the top. At the bottom, it's pretty much about the same. But at the top, there's a lot more blurring, a lot more let's get it out versus let's get something good out. They're rushed. Everything's being rushed. I've met lots of engineers, developers, CEOs, and they all complain that things are going too fast right now. I would probably agree. Maybe too fast for people to assimilate all the change, and also too fast to put out good products or as good a product as we could. There are, of course, exceptional companies that do that. Susan?
Oh, that's so true. And I just wanted to point out, too, that I like what you're saying, Bill. The big caveat that comes to my mind is the fact that how do we know that a company is going to be around even 2 to 3 years from now? So even if we have that strategic thinker, they don't really have a chance to build that ability. But what we do have is we have people who have dreams, we have not-for-profits. So maybe one way for someone to actually stay connected and develop that long-term thinking is to have a vision and a dream, but to apply it into something where they have a little bit more self-determination, which would be maybe starting their own not-for-profit or getting involved in volunteerism.
A lot of interesting points that have been brought up here. Yes, if you're working for a very small firm and the thought is that we might not even be around in 2 years, as someone who's going through the process of thinking about a 10-year plan, probably is not a good fit. You need doers. You need people that can operate in that 1 year time frame because you need results within 1 year. And that's the strategic thinking portion of it. If we talk about ExxonMobil, And let's go back to the 1980s. Well, what are the probability in the 1980s that Exxon is going to exist in 30 years? Well, the probability is very high that they're going to exist, and you need someone thinking 30 years out to get the organization headed down that line. So thinking in these time frames is not a good fit with every group and every organization. The other part that we need to address, two more points here. One is that we have to emphasize with scientists and engineers all the time in an applied sense, you are using your good scientific and engineering skills to make money for your organization. You are not using your good scientific skills only and primarily to come up with good scientific research breakthroughs. Primarily, it's to make money for your organization. That's the monetary goal of doing this. The other thing to keep in mind, as I said, we can go so many different ways with this, but the last point I want to make on that question, Rick and Susan, is that oftentimes as a manager, you may be managing very creative, in my case, let's say geologists, who are exceptionally creative and hardworking individuals. And how you manage that creative process, Susan, which you said might be a 3 to 5 year time frame process. And at the same time, I have to manage engineers who are the doers, the guys that are getting it done today. Well, I'm managing very concrete thinking engineers in 1 year or 6 month processes at the same time that I'm managing a exploration geologist in a 5 year time frame. So if I go in one morning and my engineer, who's my doer, has his feet up on his desk and is looking out the window, I probably have to interrupt that process and say, we need to get to work. We need results, today, tomorrow, or within the next 6 months. My creative geologist, who has his feet up on the desk and is looking out the window, I'm not going to interrupt him, because something might be brewing in his mind artistically, Rick, as you talked about. Mm-hmm. He's got to integrate a lot of different things, and he's got to think like an artist. I have to give him a lot of creative thinking time. And so I don't interrupt his process, where I do interrupt that guy that's on the right-hand or the left-hand side of those diagrams that we looked at first. So these basic tools we can use to manage for short-term time frames, and we can use to manage for long-term time frames.
That's great.
Most of us do work, as we talked about, and Rick, your question is, most people live in that 1 year or less time frame for most of their working career and most of their academic careers.
And I apologize, but I have to interrupt you now, and we have to call this a show because Susan has to leave in about 30 seconds ago. So,
I apologize for that.
Bill, we'd love to have you back on, because I think we're touching the surface, and I think this would be a lot of fun to continue some of the conversation, because it has so many impacts on everything we do in a lot of different ways. And Susan, do you want to ask you a question real quickly before we take off?
Yes, our classic question we ask every week. Bill, what is it that has given you an edge in life?
Susan, it's given me an edge because these are some of these principles that we've looked at today are some of the things that I implemented very early in my career, even starting at the age of 7. I saw some of these things, and I saw it again in high school. And again, most high school boys are thinking about what they're eating for dinner tonight. And so understanding these principles, and that obviously I didn't understand these as well as I do today when I was 25 years old, but understanding some of these principles and then how to implement these principles, not only in my academic work, but also making a plan of how that success is going to go forward throughout my career and throughout my life, and then making sure that those around me, especially my family, understands what my long-term plans are and what the strategy are, has probably been one of the things. And then not only the plans and the strategy, but then understanding what I have to do to implement to get to some long-term strategy and what I need to do to get there has probably given me a little bit of a heads up on other people that I'm competing against academically and in my professional career.
That's a great answer.
Well, Bill, appreciate having you on. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to contact you?
On those slides, on the very first slide and the very last slide, I have both my telephone number on there and my email at Riverford Resources. And if anybody would like to contact me at either one of those, these are topics I like to talk about as well as many other topics in management and managing people, as well as the sciences that we deal in natural resources all the time.
Sounds great. If you're watching the show, please subscribe, give us your feedback, and we will see you next week. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks a lot, Bill, for coming on. Susan,
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Bill.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye-bye.